The bubonic plague is a disease we closely associate with the Middle Ages, but in 1900 there was a horrific outbreak in Glasgow. It initially hit the overcrowded Gorbals district. Transported from the east via the world's ports, it came to the Clyde and was given fuel and speed by unsanitary living conditions in squalid tenements. By the end of the 19th century, Glasgow, as a centre of industry and shipbuilding, was one of the largest and richest cities in the world. But disease had afflicted the city's slums for decades, from the mid-1800s right up to the 1960s. In the early Victorian era, when Frederick Engels described the conditions of the working class, he stated that its poor districts may be regarded as the sources of those frightful epidemics which, beginning here, spread desolation over Glasgow. It's no small wonder Glasgow in the 19th century was a city where sickness could run rampant, for its filthy conditions were a breeding ground for disease. Many lived in wretched squalor within courts and blind alleys leading off a labyrinth of lanes and wynds. Homes which were dilapidated and ill-ventilated were piled high with inhabitants, sometimes 3 or 4 families to a single floor, and it was not unusual to find 20 people packed one on top of another. These dwellings were so damp, filthy, and ruinous that it was said no one could wish to keep his horse in one of them. One author, writing in 1839, said that it wasn't until he visited the wynds of Glasgow that he could believe that so much crime, misery, and disease could exist in a civilized country. Revolting as the outward appearance of these courts was, the filth and wretchedness within was yet worse. The same writer found sleeping places with a complete layer of human beings. Men and women indiscriminately stretched upon the floor, often 15 to 20, some clad, others naked. Their bed was a litter of mouldy straw mixed with rags. There was little or no furniture, and the only thing which gave these dens any shimmer of habitableness was a fire upon the hearth. Theft and prostitution was said to be the chief means of subsistence. Glasgow's authorities found that it was humans, not rats, spreading the plague. They linked the outbreak of 1900 to the death of a fishhawker and to mourners at her wake, spreading the disease further. Wakes of plague victims were subsequently banned. Ships were held for investigation, disinfection was implemented, and families quarantined. Despite 35 recorded cases of plague and 16 deaths, the third plague pandemic was contained. The outbreak of plague created panic amongst Glasgow's inhabitants, and it is this fearful atmosphere into which the investigative journalist Robert Sherrard arrived. Concerned with the conditions in which the very poorest lived in Britain's towns and cities, he resolved to expose squalor with a view to seeking an improvement. In 1900, he started out on his journey, dressed in working-class clothes, living in modest lodgings, and eating the same food as everyday people. Sherrard obtained his information from the very people who were suffering appalling living conditions, instead of local officials who are more likely to hide the truth, rather than give their town a bad name. Today, you will hear much of what he revealed in his visit to the slums of Glasgow. Foul sights, even fouler odours, evil drink, and harrowing tales of poverty.
Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive.
It was a damp, cold morning when I alighted in Glasgow, but failing to get in anywhere, I walked about the city. I cannot say how many times I was accosted that early morning by vagrant men begging for the smallest copper for a mug of something warm. It has been a cold night, or "Vara cold the neat," was what they told me. I did not know then what I learned afterwards, that there is no casual ward in Scotland, and that these gentlemen who wanted cocoa or something stronger had, perforce, to walk about all night. I was anxious, as soon as might be, to visit the sites where the plague first broke out, for, like everybody else, I suppose, I imagined that these streets must be something very dreadful indeed, besides which Tatlock Street, Liverpool, or Montgomery Street, Dublin, would show as wholesome and pleasant dwelling places. And so, directed by a policeman, I made my way down fine business streets, until I emerged on a large square, which I observed was called Jail Square, a fact which added to the cheerfulness of the impression I was receiving. Across Jail Square and over a bridge, at the end of which, as a passer-by informed me, I could take my choice as to plague streets. "That street to the right there," he said, "is Thistle Street. That's where the plague broke out. That street to the left there is Rose Street, where the plague went on, but you won't find any plague in Glasgow now." This last with a certain ring of defiance in the voice, which I frequently noticed afterwards when speaking about the plague. Glasgow seemed very ashamed of its occurrence, as Glasgow has every right to be. I chose Thistle Street, and I was surprised to find myself walking down a broad and airy thoroughfare, the houses on either side of which had by no means the dilapidated appearance I had expected. But as I progressed, I noticed little entrances on either side, and posted up in these entrances were ominous notices headed "Wakes," warning the inhabitants in the dark regions to which, as I presumed, these entrances and these passages conducted one against holding over the corpses of persons who had died of the plague those drunken revelries which the posters designated. I fancy for her nothing could surpass the picture which I conjured up that grey Glasgow morning. As standing in one of these narrow passages, I read by the flickering light of the vesta this ominous warning, and I think it would trouble even Zola himself to do justice to the infinite misery and squalor of such scenes as had so often been recently enacted behind the hypocritical house frontages of Thistle Street. The squalid room, the hideously disfigured putrescent corpse on the heap of rags which had been its bed, and sprawling about the room the ragged and drunken revellers, seen dimly in clouds of pungent smoke which veiled the flickering light of the tallow dips. Things of the past as they are, the menace to Glasgow always remains in a city where overcrowding is so terrible that one hears of a building in James Street where 60 families live, where 25, 30, and 40 families can be found in one close or court, and where the number of families living in one room, apartments, is so great that, as was recently stated from a Glasgow pulpit, more than 100,000 of the population were born in such homes. As I have said, however, at first sight, Thistle Street, hypocritical, suggests none of these things. The dark picture under the shadow of the Black Death, which one had conjured up, resolved itself into a very ordinary, shabby, but broad and airy thoroughfare. Indeed, the house in which the plague first broke out shows like one of those picturesque structures which in our youth the drawing masters made us copy. A rustic flight of steps leading upwards to the door. The appearance of this courtyard was, until one looked closely into it, the hypocrisy of Thistle Street once more, remarkably clean and fresh. "Ah, but that," said a bystander, "is because they have whitewashed it since." He also invited me, in an ironical manner, to go and have a look inside the rooms, "which is exactly what I hope to do," I said. However, it was then too early to disturb the household, and so I contented myself somewhat to the suspicion of people passing in the street, with examining in detail the passages, corners, and staircases of this whitened sepulchre. For as I said, whitened, whitewashed it is, and sepulchre it has been, and may be again. For here, as in so many thousand Glasgow homes, one-roomed apartments are the entire accommodation of whole families, and in this fact alone lies the menace of death less foul perhaps, but inasmuch as lingering, more cruel indeed than the death that came across so many miles of ocean from a land of sun and flowers, to make that street of mud and mist notorious and formidable throughout the world. For, as was recently stated, and proved with facts and figures by Dr. Russell, the medical health officer of Glasgow, mortality by chest diseases, and notably by consumption, is proportionate in families to the number of rooms occupied by the families. For instance, if the proportion of deaths by these diseases is 5% in one-roomed homes, it will be less in two-roomed houses, and so on. And such homes, too, as one sees in Glasgow. Their squalor, it is true, is less apparent than in Dublin, for here, as in Edinburgh, the evil shrinks from sight, and as I did that morning, you may walk for miles in the worst districts of Glasgow, either in Brigate or the south side slums, with expanded lungs in breezy thoroughfares, that is, if you overlook, as easily a stranger might do, those little dark apertures, the entrance to the closes on either side of the street. Down these gullets, on dark courtyards reached by winding passages in which yawns pestilentially the common dustbin, and up gloomy staircases, more muddy than the pavements without, you find the labyrinthine dwellings of the one-roomed tenants. For the rest, the poverty is such in Glasgow that it is difficult for the poor people to pay more than 8, 9, or 10 shillings a month. Rents are paid monthly in Glasgow, which are demanded for these one-roomed homes. About 18 shillings a week seems the maximum a casual labourer can hope for, but the city is so overcrowded with unskilled labourers of every kind that jobs are precarious in the extreme. 4.5 and 5 pence an hour is to be earned at the docks, so many labourers told me, and it is by the hour here. That is to say, a man can be discharged at the end of his first hour, and set adrift once more with his 4.5 or his 5 pence in his pocket. Here, again, as various persons familiar with the poor of Glasgow told me, drink is one of the chief causes of the distress that exists. "Drink," said a publican to me at the corner of Rose Street. "They never seem to get away from it." And he laughed, a fat, complacent laugh at the folly of his tribute-paying vassals. "A warren of them," he added, "was all round about, and if I wanted to see how close human beings could be packed and yet live, I had only to step across the road and enter the first close on the left." I did so, and found the courtyard, barring the dust-bin, decent enough. But the number of gloomy windows looking out, story and story high, on that narrow and airless enclosure, and the faces at the windows, the swarms of little children with no other playground than the landings of the staircases, and reminding me of some beautiful lines in a poem of Maeterlinck's, the wistful faces of agricultural labourers who have left the wide expanse of fields to cabin and confine themselves in these human kennels. The Glasgow tenement house, as the London one, looking out on narrow courtyards, is, I think, infinitely more wretched than even the cottages of the Liverpool poor. These at least have their kitchens on the courtyard. The children, wanting a breath of air, can toddle down the doorsteps and so out into the street. But what about the children of Glasgow, perched in their homes on the 6th floor of a tenement house? I explored Glasgow all that day, and the night found me in the Gallowgate district. It is curious how the very names of these places add to the depression which a visit to them causes. The Gallowgate, and the candidates for its functions loafing at the corners, sprawling in the mud, overthronging the public houses. The sight of ragged women, barefooted and suckling their babies in the streets, is in Glasgow so common a one that no one pays any attention to these poor maternities. At noon that day, I followed 2 such women down Argyle Street. Masterfully and unabashed, they trod along the wet pavement, as unconscious of the squalor of their appearance as if female coquetry had never been. and I noticed that not a soul of the crowds which passed them paid attention to the degrading spectacle. In Rose Street, at the Salvation Army slum office, I heard the same story of drink, 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 which has been dinned into my ears ever since I set out on my squalid journey. Indeed, it would appear that intemperance causes a serious weekly loss not only to the wage earners of the city, but to the city's trade. Whilst I was in Glasgow, a complaint was formulated in the papers by the masters of a big shipbuilding yard as to the difficulties they had in carrying out their contracts, owing to the number of unsteady men employed as riveters. A very large sum was mentioned as representing the loss in wages, which might otherwise have been earned but for this unsteadiness. As soon as many of the men have earned enough for their alcoholic requirements for the rest of the week, they throw down their hammers and away. That is the same in most towns, I presume. But in Glasgow it seems particularly sad that, while so many thousands who are idle would be only too willing to work, men who can earn good wages should neglect their opportunities. A feature, by the way, of the intemperance of Glasgow, and the same can be noticed in Edinburgh, and indeed all over Scotland, is the great extent of Sunday drinking. The public houses, indeed, are closed on Sundays in Scotland, but here, as in Wales or in Norway, the drinkers have found an alternative which renders the remedy worse than the danger. On Saturday nights, in any Glasgow or Edinburgh public house, you could see a huge pile of flasks heaped up on the counter. "Yes, we do a big bottle trade on Saturday nights," said an Edinburgh publican to me. But the bulk of Sunday drinking is done in the working men's clubs, which abound in both cities. These clubs being cooperative concerns, your drinker has the satisfaction and the inducement of knowing that the more money he spends in his club, the bigger the profits of the club will be, and the larger his bonus, when these profits are distributed amongst the members. As to the ease with which admittance can be gained to these drinking houses, a tramp whom I met in the grass market in Edinburgh was good enough to enlighten me. It is not necessary to put your name down years ahead and to wait your election, as you do for Athenaeum, say, or the Carlton, private members' clubs in London. You go there and you say you want to become a member, and you pay the yearly subscription of 5 shillings in advance, and a member you become. He was good enough to add that if I was staying overnight, that was on a Saturday night, we might doss at the same fourpenny model, a lodging house. Then, next day, if I had a bob or two, he would take me to a club of which certain mates of his were members, and he would introduce me to them, and that, whilst one mate would take me into the club as his guest, another would take him in as his guest, and we should then enjoy as good a booze as we had ever had in our lives. We were to be paying guests, of course. My brass would have to be handed over to the pals as an indispensable preliminary and the essence of the contract. Under these circumstances, that is to say, where such facilities are accorded for Sunday drinking in Scotland, it is not surprising that one should see so many intoxicated people in the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow on that day. I heard a gentleman from Birmingham declare in the smoking room of a Newcastle hotel that he had seen more drunken people in the streets of Glasgow before 10 o'clock on Sunday morning than he could see in a whole week in his native town.